Joining me today is Dr. Stacey Freedenthal, and you've got a focus that's not something as prominent that I've come across, and so I am supremely intrigued with where this conversation can go, because this is also not a topic that would commonly be talked about in a lot of podcasts necessarily, say the ones that were for professionals or people in the mental health field. But Stacey is you call yourself a suicidologist. And how did you land here? Because your book that I've seen is The Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. And so it is a definite need, because it is prominent, and we will come across it potentially in our lives. But how did you land here in this particular focus?
Sure. It's a great question. And first, let me say suicidologist is a real word, even though not everybody acknowledges it. But it's somebody who studies or specializes their practice on suicide prevention. Mm-hmm. So my path to specializing in suicidology, there are really two paths, the professional and the personal. And the professional is that my first foray into clinical work was even before I got my master's degree in social work. And that was volunteering at a suicide hotline in Dallas. And then after that, I got that was volunteer. And then during my graduate program, I worked as a job at a counseling center's 24-hour line. And then thereafter, just every clinical job I had was in some kind of emergency setting where suicidality was a pressing issue for many people. And then personally, I lost a friend to suicide when I was young. I myself had suicidal thoughts when I was young, and well into my 20s, I made a couple suicide attempts. So I've had a personal interest in the topic as well.
Okay, which that's, I keep coming across this, and you probably do too, that we wind up with things that we've overcome or we're battling, or, that we kind of, when we can pivot it, building from Viktor Frankl's work in a lot of ways, if I can shift it to where, how do I make meaning out of my struggle, my bent, my path? Sometimes I can go beyond it and help other people, which is what you do. And so particularly I want to spend the time in the first part of our conversation today, Stacey, on the idea of helping people that, like, when you have a part of your family, a part of your world, because this is a conversation. Tell me if I'm off on this, because obviously being trained in the field as well as a marriage and family therapist, as well. When you do the training, you will spend some time being introduced to how do you help somebody, a client that's got suicidal ideation tendencies, attempts, etc. But when you hear it just out in the common vernacular among people, I don't know if a lot of people know how to react to it.
There's a lot of fear, and I will say, ideally in training, therapists are taught how to work with somebody who has suicidal thoughts.
Good distinction. Good distinction. Yes.
I mean, there's research, and in fact, I conducted a study, but it was quite a few years ago, that most mental health professionals receive very little training in working with individuals who have suicidal thoughts. And a lot of the challenges with professionals mirror those among the general population, and that is that it's a scary topic. And, there's a lot of myths that people have about, if I bring up suicide, then it'll give the person the idea, or I might cause them to kill themselves, or, I might make things worse. Mm-hmm. And those are really big fears. It's terrible to have somebody die by suicide that you love.
And so just to get ahead of it, you're talking about that one right there in particular is a myth, that if I bring it up, it will implant the thought.
Yes. In fact, I have a post on my website, and the title is something like, "Are you scared of planning the thought of suicide?" And there's been quite a bit of research in recent years where they've looked at, and in some ingenious ways, they've looked at, does asking about suicidal thoughts do harm to the person who's being asked? And consistently, the answer is no.
Okay.
There are some people, there's a very small proportion of people who say it upset them a little bit, but it passed very quickly. And, you know, for if somebody gets upset a little bit about being asked about suicidal thoughts, that's a small price to pay for a big reward of potentially finding out that someone is having suicidal thoughts and needs help.
Right. Okay. And so that then leads us straight into the conversation I think we need to have if we're talking about loving and interacting with somebody that either you know, or there's signs that point towards, or there's something that's shifted. And so what are, from your experience and your training and your take, what are the signs that we need to be aware of as far as our relationship to people, that this could be a reality that we're going to face?
Yeah, there's different things to be on the lookout for, but I also want to give the caveat that some people hide very well that they have suicidal thoughts.
Correct.
And that's because, I mean, you know, there's many different reasons, but the ones that come up most frequently that I hear about are, I don't want the person to freak out. I don't want them to call the police. I don't want to burden them with worrying about me. I don't want them to judge me. You know, so there's all these different reasons people hide. And so about half of people actively withhold information about their suicidal thoughts, even to therapists, which is sobering as a therapist.
Yes, it is.
And so the things to look out for, though, you know, there are often clues as well. And even when somebody's hiding, these clues can kind of leak. You know, they can slip out without the person realizing. So the obvious ones, you know, are the ones that you hear about a lot, like somebody appears depressed, somebody's gone through a major loss and is isolating, or you know, they're talking about death. You know, they're saying things like, I wish I were dead, or what's the purpose of living? And then, of course, if they say, I'm having thoughts of killing myself, then that's the biggest, clearest sign of all. But there also can be subtle things to look out for. And one that I've found is jokes. You know, people will, I don't know if you ever saw this about Anthony Bourdain, but in the years before he died by suicide, he constantly joked about it.
I was not aware of that.
Yeah, somebody compiled a list of about 30 different occasions where on air he made a joke about suicide. And then, of course, that tells you that there were probably many other times, too, that either weren't on air or this person didn't find, because there's such voluminous recordings of him. But he would say things like, if I have a bad cheeseburger in the airport, I'm going to kill myself. And then at various times, he would get more specific and say how he would kill himself. And then at some point, he even started talking about where. And as it happened, he fulfilled those harbingers. And just
to clarify, just for the sake of the audience, because I think it's important that we point this out, that we're talking, tell me if I'm off on this. This is where I want you, with your training, to help fill in my gaps, that if I've got some on it too.
Sure.
This is where what I believe in this and what I've been taught in this and look out for in this is the escalation of it is one of the major signs that where you're talking about, okay, you're joking about it or it's mentioned. That's something. That's a flag. That's good data to have. But then if they start adding in a little bit more detail on the plan, and then they add in the time or the how, and all of those are escalating signs.
Definitely, the more specific the information is, the more extensive the information is, the more worried, you know, we should be. And not everybody does that.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, that is the one thing that I'm assuming from your experience, that if somebody has that deep down and they're withholding and they're hiding it. There's not much anybody can do because they're going to. This is where it gets complicated, isn't it? That it's the whole. I'm trying to orient. I'm trying to help, but if I don't have the information and I'm not being told the information, I'm limited on what I can do.
Well, I think it's such a difficult balance, Corey, because. Which, by the way, I didn't ask you. Is it okay to call you Corey?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. It's such a difficult balance because on the one hand, there's a myth that if somebody's made up their mind to die by suicide, there's nothing we can do. And that's not true. I mean, we know that there are many people who have been so resolved to die by suicide that they've made a suicide attempt. And yet 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt are still alive even decades later.
Okay.
And there was a study where people were interviewed who had been stopped from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. Same findings, 90% years later had not died by suicide. So there are things we can do, but the balance that's difficult is I don't want to perpetuate the myth that there's nothing we can do.
Thank you.
But we also can't do everything.
That's a great distinction.
Yeah. And it's something it's another blog post of mine where I say, do everything you can, but know that you can't do everything.
Okay.
And so I would say the very first thing we can do, and that a lot of people don't because of the taboo and because of the fears, is to ask somebody directly, are you thinking of killing yourself? And, and it doesn't have to be, hey, how are you doing? Are you thinking of killing yourself? I mean, there can be a buildup to it. And,
right.
And one of the ways could be, gosh, a lot of people who joke about suicide, say the person's been joking.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people who joke about suicide, they're actually having suicidal thoughts. Have you been thinking of suicide?
Mm-hmm.
And not many people get asked that directly. Like, it can have an effect.
Yeah, that goes back to that idea of this is such a scary thing that we could start seeing, again, fill in the gaps for me here, Stacey, that some of the things that I look for in the people I live life with, the clients that I have that come in and out over the years, particularly family members of somebody that could have major depression, suicidal ideation, some of these things that we're talking about today, is when you see a demonstrative change, that's a sign. There's something has shifted, right? Because
Yes.
It's a normal happy-go-lucky kid or spouse, and now all of a sudden they're not. They're more withdrawn. They're more isolated. There's some behavior patterns that have changed, and then you couple that with the joking. Now all of a sudden, I think there's a part of us as humans that I start seeing some of these that are scary, and I want to look away. I don't want to face it. I don't want to really look at that tough path that they're in, let alone me alongside it and what it could do to me, impact me, and I think that's what starts to become the whole, I don't want to bring it up. Maybe it's just a phase. Maybe we should just go on a vacation. Maybe, I do this when I get uncomfortable with other subjects at times where it's like, I just make a joke. I just want to lighten the mood,
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, in the long run, though, that's not serving those I care about or myself better. Whereas what you're describing is, how do I find the courage of, hey, you know what? I've noticed some things that are different. Are they so bad that you're actually thinking of suicide and harm? And, there's just that, because that's all relational language then.
It's really hard. I mean, there's so much about talking with somebody about suicide that has a lot of paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes is that it can really help the other person, but it can also be incredibly frightening for you,
Mm-hmm.
and you may be afraid of being harmed. Like some people, they feel like, oh, if I ask them, then I'll get depressed, like I'll get pulled into their despair, or I won't know what to do. I mean, one of the biggest fears when I ask people what they're afraid of in terms of asking someone if they have suicidal thoughts, one of the biggest fears is that the person says yes.
Mm-hmm.
And what a paradox. because we want the person to say yes if they are thinking of suicide.
Right.
And yet,
but we don't want to hear it.
Exactly. And so then I have a whole chapter in my book on what I call brave listening. And, it's not anything I made up. In clinical literature, it's called active listening, know, but I'm kind of using this different term because, first of all, active listening is very jargony. And second of all, because it really does require bravery, A, to ask what scares you to ask, and B, to listen to what's scary to hear. And it can be so scary to hear somebody talk about suicide. And I'm sure that you've witnessed this too. Tell me if I'm like, Stacey splaining.
Oh, no. Well, but okay. All right. This is a good caveat we need to at least insert here. This is two professionals talking about a topic we are versed in. People that are listening are not. So Stacey splain away. Now I'm having to retrieve that thought. But what I was going to say is just that people, when they get scared, they protect themselves too. And so some ways they may protect themselves. And now I'm talking about the person who's asking about suicide. So the ways they may protect themselves are to say, it'll get better, like if the person says, yes, I am having suicidal thoughts, and these can all be well-intentioned, and they'll say, it can get better. Or they may say, how could you think of that? You have so much to live for. Right. And then they list off all the reasons a person shouldn't think of suicide. And then sometimes judgment can enter, and they'll say things like, how could you think of hurting me like that? How could you think of hurting our kids like that? And again, they're well-intentioned. They want the person to not attempt suicide. And yet those good intentions may not be received as such by the person who has suicidal thoughts. And that's the scary thing, because they often aren't. And even let's move it just beyond the realm of suicidal talk and ideation and plans to just uncomfortable things of life.
Yes.
That, when I ask how things, this is the proverbial thing I use a lot as examples when I'm teaching or getting a chance to speak, is the politeness that takes place in civility, and particularly in church settings sometimes, of the, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm so great. When deep down, no, you're not, right? You've got all kinds of stuff that have maybe gone on, and you don't want to share it because the times you have, it hasn't been received well, or you don't want to, so there's this facade of, I want to be perceived a certain way, rather than, if someone asks how you doing and you're like, do you really want to know? There's an element of us as humans like, I don't know if I do. I don't know if I got the amount of time or energy or the bandwidth and so the beauty I have of thinking of your work and how it can apply to more than just the specifics of your work is this brave listening means I'm getting in a hole with somebody that's scary, and I don't necessarily have to have the way out for them, but I need to learn how to get in there to listen, to be real, to let them know they're not alone, to give them something as far as a relationship that it provides, that it's not the ultimate answer right away, but it's love and it's care and it's presence.
Love, care, presence, empathy, an attempt to understand. And I would say curiosity, not prurient curiosity, but staying curious and suspending judgment and trying to understand what's happening that makes the person feel that way. Yeah. So, and I totally agree with you. I mean, there are two things I want to say, well, maybe three, about what you said. And one is, we also see this with death, that if somebody loses a loved one, people have a really hard time knowing what to say and how to listen. And so some of the things that people will say, and again, with good intentions, they'll say things like, and I apologize if I'm offending anybody who has this religious orientation, but they'll say things like, God has a plan, or it happened for a reason.
Don't apologize for that, because I think that's projecting our discomfort. Not that, because this is, all right, let's add this caveat.
Another caveat.
Because I think it's important. It's an important distinction. This is what I keep coming across with the spirit life and the religious life. That when you reach a struggle in life, and you have even what we're talking about today with suicide and walking alongside somebody, or even wrestling with it ourselves, maybe. Oftentimes you hear the platitudes of, "Oh, you just need to pray more," and not that that's wrong. It's not enough, though.
And
right?
It can be premature. It can shut down the conversation. When what we want is for people to open up.
Right, because I think that's that element of I just shut it down by my discomfort of where this is going. And so I'm then feeling this helpless. So therefore I offer something, because then I feel like I'm better because I at least offered something rather than what maybe needs to be offered in that moment is just me. Even with the whole, I don't know what to do with what you just told me, but I want you to know you're not alone.
Right. And oh my gosh, that must be so hard. I'm sorry that you're going through that. Tell me more.
Yeah.
And of course, you and I are therapists, so.
Well, and let's add that caveat too, because it's not like it's necessarily easy for us as humans to have these conversations too.
Well, and I talk in my new book about, on the one hand, this can seem like, oh, you have to have a degree in counseling to be able to be that present with somebody. But on the other hand, there people who work in customer service are trained in how to listen. And people who are parents, they can read the book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, and Listen So Kids Will Talk. So it doesn't require an advanced degree.
Right.
And by the way, nothing against people who work in customer service, but what I mean is they don't have an advanced degree in psychotherapy.
No, right, but they have learned how to relate to people and interact and hear and respond. And there's a huge difference of the importance that can take. So before we run out of time with this segment, Stacey, so we're kind of setting up. I love the concept of the courage to at least ask the questions, to get specifics. If there's a family member, a spouse, a kid, a relative of some sort, that you're kind of seeing the signs, you're kind of getting the words, you're hearing the jokes, you're hearing the thought. It's being mentioned in passing. There's changes that have happened. So you ask the questions, what's the next follow-up for them? I mean, obviously this is huge, but I want to get one more step that we can offer up from your experience that a person can do that truly is beneficial and life-giving in the long run, hopefully.
So I'm going to say two things. One is to listen and to try to, not to immediately launch into an interrogation of, well, do you have a plan? Do you have the means? Do you, when would you do this? But there's research that shows that a very powerful question can be, can you tell me the story of why? Or can you tell me the story of what happened to make you think of suicide?
Yeah.
Something that opens it up for the person to say in their own words what's happening. And then I think the other thing, so one thing is to listen and be receptive and, invite the person to say more. The other thing is there's this common stereotype in public that I've run into repeatedly that people think they need to call 911.
Okay.
And I would say, unless the person is truly on the verge of ending their life right now, like they've got a weapon in hand, or they've already taken a substance to, try to kill themselves, unless it's something urgent like that, then calling 911 can be a real conversation stopper.
Right.
And it can harm the relationship because it's kind of shifting the listening to somebody else saying, and it's well-intentioned. Again, people are afraid, but most people, every year in the United States, it's something like 14 to 15 million people have serious suicidal thoughts. And it's tragic. I don't want to understate this. It's tragic that almost 50,000 die. But it also means that 99.7% don't take their life. 99.7% of people with serious suicidal thoughts don't take their life. And so calling 911 automatically can do damage. It's
too reactionary is what you're describing. That it's like, hey, you can be a conduit for something first is what you're describing. That's that idea of the brave listening, the good question It's a follow-up. And I'm a proponent of everybody in the population. If we can learn just one good question that I can use in a lot of different situations can change the outcome of so many of them, because I've learned how to shift it back to the moment, or how to stay engaged, or even, I've used this with people too. It's just the whole, I don't know what to do with that. But and you even added, but can you tell me more?
Yeah.
Right. Because there's that component of this is that is a pro-relationship movement.
Yeah. I want to understand.
Right. Because you're then demonstrating care, which is a lot of times, I think, what all of us as humans are desperately longing for. Is
care,
I want to feel cared for and connected. Exactly.
And I also don't want to be naive and make it sound like that's all that's necessary. There are, I'm always thinking from different angles, and I want to be really careful. Somebody who's lost a loved one to suicide, it doesn't mean that they didn't listen. Even if first of all, if they didn't listen, then they were doing the best they could with the information they had. They were, we live in a culture where listening in some ways is discouraged for the reasons we've said. But second of all, even if they did do everything that's recommended, suicide can still happen. And that's because, there are forces that we still don't understand that are bigger than any one person.
Okay. Well, Stacey, I want to, before we transition into a little bit of a deeper conversation, still, if we could even go deeper with this topic, which I know we can, how can people find you and the work that you do? Because it's so important and vital to make sure everybody is equipped, particularly those that may be facing this, because maybe this is a show that they're listening to and it's like, man, this is striking a chord. So how can they equip themselves?
Well, thank you. The first thing I would say is I have a website, speakingofsuicide.com, and it has a lot of articles for people all along the spectrum of those affected by suicidality, including people who have suicidal thoughts themselves, people who have a loved one who has suicidal thoughts, people who have lost somebody to suicide, people who have attempted suicide and survived, different things like that. So speakingofsuicide.com is kind of my biggest site and labor of love. It's had like 6 million visitors since I created it. And then I also have a site that has not had anywhere near that many visitors, and it's staceyfreedenthal.com, and that's STACEYFREEDENTHAL.com. And that's just kind of like a place, and in fact, the site's being redesigned now, but it's a place where there's sort of a hub of information about my writings, my professional work, things like that. And I do use Twitter, much to my peril at times. And my username on Twitter is sfreedenthal.
Okay.
And I also have a professional Facebook account, which is Stacey Freedenthal, PhD, LCSW. And I think that probably covers it.
Good. Well, all that will be in the show notes. So if you're hearing this today on the show and this is striking any level of chord or curiosity and concern, go check out Stacey's work because it's incredibly valuable. So thank you so much for the time thus far, Stacey.
Thank you.